It was the spring of 1946, though no one really trusted the warmth yet. The war had ended months ago, yes, at least on the headlines and in the ceremonies, but in men like me, it still lived under the skin, in the silence after distant sirens, in the haunted looks exchanged between returning soldiers on train platforms, and in the unmailed letters folded too many times to count. And so when I ebbed off that rust-rattling train into the wind-drenched streets of San Francisco, the scent of sea salt already clinging to the corners of my coat, I wasn't coming home to celebrate, to rebuild, or to forget. I was coming because I had made a promise, one that had survived every mile of mud, every hunger-choked night in that German prison camp, every friend buried, and every page torn from the calendar of a world on fire. Her name was Emily, and I loved her with the kind of urgency you only understand when death becomes a neighbor. Not the distant concept you discuss over newspapers, but the thing you smell on the breath of the man in the next bunk. The thing that looks you in the eye when your rations run out, or when your last letter home is returned unopened. And I made her a vow in 1944, in a borrowed moment, of quiet between sirens, on a night when the city lights had been blacked out and the shadows wrapped around us like the future itself, trembling and uncertain, but still ours for the taking, if we were brave enough to believe in it. "If I make it out of this alive," I whispered into her hair, one hand pressed against the softness of her shoulder, the other clenched with everything I couldn't yet say, "meet me at the dock, May 7th, sunset." And she didn't cry, not that night, only held my hand so tight I could feel her entire soul in the way her fingers trembled and nodded. That promise, that small, desperate promise, became the only compass I had left when the map stopped making sense, when we were herded like cattle across frozen terrain, when winter wrapped its fingers around my ribs and tried to press the breath from my lungs, when I stopped being a soldier and started being a number. I would close my eyes in the bunk, her last letter folded under my tongue like communion, and I would see her standing by the waterfront dressed in white, with the wind pulling her hair just slightly loose from the clip she always wore, the sun dying behind her, gold and fire on the waves waiting. And so 2 years later, when I finally stood at the edge of that pier, May 7, 1946, just before sunset, with the ocean stretching out in front of me like memory itself, I expected everything and feared everything. I imagined her arms open, her eyes filled with relief and anger, her steps running toward me, or her silence as she turned away. But what I saw was the SS Golden Gate pulling away, smoke rising from its stacks like a last breath, ropes already cast off, the crowd dispersing, and there, just barely, a figure on the upper deck, one hand lifted in the wind, a white dress, a dark scarf. Maybe it was her, maybe it was my imagination, but I didn't run, I didn't shout, I just stood there as the ship carried her away. And with it, perhaps, the last part of me that still believed in timing. If this story moved you like it moved me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing true stories that inspire, break your heart, and stay with you. And now, brace yourself, because what comes next changes everything. They say freedom comes all at once, with the sound of gates swinging open, with the roar of your own breath when you realize no one's holding a rifle to your back anymore. But when I was liberated from that camp in Germany in the frozen jaws of 1945, it didn't feel like freedom at all. It felt like stepping out of one kind of prison and into another. The kind built from silence, hunger, the loss of friends whose names I still whispered before sleep, and the weight of a promise that had somehow outlived all of us. I was gaunt, my hands swollen from cold and rot, my coat more whole than fabric, and my face, when I dared catch it in the reflection of train windows, looked like it belonged to someone else, someone hollowed out, scraped thin by time. But I still had the letter, Emily's, folded so many times the creases had turned to tears. I still had the words, May 7th, at the dock, at sunset, I'll be there. And that was enough to start walking. Getting out of Europe was a miracle in itself. I traded scraps of tobacco for train fare, rode for miles pressed against strangers who didn't speak, who only stared straight ahead, each of us wondering if anything we'd left behind was still standing. When I finally reached a boat bound for the States, I didn't even remember how long it had taken. Days, weeks. The calendar in my head had melted, leaving only one date glowing, May 7th. On the ship, I watched the Atlantic churn beneath us like a great beast with no master, and I dreamed of California, not the California of sunshine and orange groves, but of her face, the way she tilted her head when she listened, the exact shade of her lipstick the day I left. Once we docked in New York, I didn't wait for approval or orders. I jumped trains, walked for miles, slept in back alleys and under overpasses, clung to rail cars and begged station agents to let me ride. I crossed rivers, passed through towns I'd only heard of in passing, and everywhere, America looked like a half-healed wound. Posters peeling off walls, soldiers limping home, mothers crying softly on bus benches, stores reopening with lights too bright for the grief inside. But none of that mattered. All I could see was the dock. San Francisco, the bay, Emily standing just as she'd written, just as I'd dreamed. I reached the city on the evening of May 6th. My boots were soaked through, my jacket stiff with salt, and my body aching in ways I can't explain, but I had made it. I found a room above a butcher shop, the air thick with smoke and old fat, but it had a window that faced the water, and I sat there most of the night, the letter open on the sill, letting the breeze from the bay turn its corners like fingers from another life. I didn't sleep. I didn't want to miss a second. On May 7th, I washed my face in cold water, buttoned my shirt all the way to the collar, and walked through the city as it stirred awake. Trolley bells ringing, seagulls crying, the fog rolling off the hills like breath from the earth itself. My hands trembled as I neared the pier. I held her letter in my coat pocket, fingertips running over the paper like it was a lifeline. I imagined her already there, perhaps pacing, perhaps sitting on one of the benches, scanning the crowd with wide, hopeful eyes. I imagined walking up behind her and whispering her name, the way I used to, and her turning, that slow, radiant turn, as if the war had never happened. But when I reached the dock, the SS Golden Gate was already pulling away. Its gangplank had been raised. Steam hissed from its chimneys, and on the deck passengers leaned against railings, waving at no one in particular. I stopped in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. And then I saw her, or I thought I did, a figure near the stern, hair wrapped in a scarf, a white dress catching the sunlight. One hand lifted. Was she waving? Was she shielding her eyes? My legs wouldn't move. My lips parted, but no sound came. I just watched, and in the space between heartbeats, the ship grew smaller. I didn't chase it. I didn't scream. I just stood there, the wind cutting through my clothes, through my ribs, through everything I had left. Around me, life moved on. Dock workers shouted to one another, crates thudded onto planks, tourists snapped photographs, but inside me, time had broken. The dock stretched before me like a stage where I had missed my cue, and the only thing left was the echo of her name in my chest. I walked to the edge and sat down. I pulled the letter from my pocket, unfolded it carefully and read it again, her handwriting still firm, still hers. May 7th, at the dock, at sunset. I'll be there. And she had been. I had too, just not at the same time. During the war, when the days blurred together and the nights stretched long enough to swallow whatever pieces of sanity we still held on to, the only thing that tethered me to the world beyond the trenches, beyond the wire, beyond the stench of fear and rust, was the act of writing, of pressing the tip of a trembling pencil against paper that barely held together, of shaping her name like a prey, like a lifeline, and letting the words pour out as though they alone could protect me from what was closing in all around. I wrote to her from foxholes, from barracks where the air hung thick with infection, from tents illuminated only by the flicker of oil lamps and dying hope. And in every word, I tried to bury the truth just deep enough so she wouldn't feel the full weight of it. while still giving her something real to hold on to, because love without honesty, even in war, is nothing more than illusion. I never told her how many men we lost in a single morning. I never described what it felt like to hear a friend whisper for his mother while holding his own insides in his hands. I never mentioned how many nights I pressed her name between my teeth like a final word before sleep, unsure if I'd ever open my eyes again. But I told her about the stars, how they looked brighter in enemy skies. I told her about the sound of laughter when someone found an extra cigarette, about the warmth of black coffee passed hand to hand, about the boys who still played cards with more passion than fear. And always, always, I ended the same way. I love you. I will return. May 7th. And she, God, Emily, she wrote back with words that didn't just reply, but rebuilt me. Her letters were sunshine folded into envelopes. She told me about the wind in the sycamores outside her window, about the neighbor's child who kept asking when her man in uniform would come home, about ration lines and sirens and the way the city never quite slept anymore. And yet, even through all of that, she wrote like someone who still believed in spring, who still believed that two people could find each other again even when the world was falling apart between them. One letter, dated late 1943, still echoes in my mind like a hymn. If you don't come back, I will come for you, but I will not let this war erase us. Then came silence. I was taken in 1944, captured near the Ardennes, marched through ice and blood and disbelief, tossed into a camp where the concept of male felt more like mythology than memory. I wrote when I could, smuggling notes through Red Cross channels, through bribed guards, through other prisoners who were released before me, but I heard nothing back. For a long time I feared the worst, that she'd stopped writing, or worse, had given up. I imagined her hands still, her pen dry, her voice quiet. But then, in the spring of 1945, when the gates opened and we were led blinking and shaking into the uncertain light of freedom, a volunteer nurse handed me a bundle wrapped in cloth, letters, dozens of them, all from her. Some had never reached me, others had been returned. A few had been intercepted and held, their corners marked with foreign stamps and crude censorship slashes across the margins. But they were hers. And when I unfolded the first one, when I saw her handwriting, still so unmistakably hers, my knees gave out. I dropped to the dirt and cried like a child. And each letter was a reminder that somewhere, across oceans and gunfire and time, someone still knew my name, someone still waited. In one letter, dated March 1945, she wrote, "They've asked me to relocate, a chance, they say, for a new life. Canada, I don't know if I should go, but I made you a promise. I'll be at the dock, May 7th at sunset. If you're alive, come, please. I won't wait any longer." And that was the last one. I read it so many times I could recite it by heart. The paper thinned at the folds. The ink smudged where my thumb pressed too often. I slept with it in my pocket, pressed against my ribs, as if her words could replace breath, as if they could pulse in time with my own heart and keep it beating when everything else threatened to stop. That letter, it became my compass, my map, my north. I don't know how long she waited at that dock. I don't know what she felt as the time passed and I didn't arrive. I don't know if she looked out at the crowd one last time before boarding the ship, or if she stepped onto that gangway already knowing I'd be too late, but I know she was there. I know she kept her word. And because of that, because even in silence, even in distance, even in all the ways we lost each other, she still believed, still wrote, still waited. I kept walking. I kept writing. I kept that promise inside me like a fire, like a vow spoken to God himself. Even now, decades later, I still wake with her voice echoing in the back of my mind, the sound of a pen scratching across paper, her words still saving me. May 7th, at the dock, at sunset. After the ship disappeared into the horizon, swallowed slowly by fog and distance, like a memory too painful to hold on to, I remained at the edge of the pier, not moving, not speaking, barely breathing. Because when you come that far, across war and wreckage, through hunger and ghosts, and find that the one moment you've lived for has already passed you by. You don't collapse, not right away. You simply become very still, as if by not moving, time might rewind just enough to give you back those lost minutes. I stood there as the sun sank into the Pacific, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, the wind tangling my hair and salt burning my eyes, until the dock workers had cleared the crates, the last seagulls had gone quiet, and the harbor was nothing but the sound of water licking the wood beneath my feet, and even then, I couldn't bring myself to leave, not without knowing more, not without understanding. Eventually, my body gave in before my will did. My knees buckled, and I sat down on the cold dock, legs dangling over the edge, and I took out her letter once more, unfolding it with the same care you'd give to sacred scripture, rereading the lines I already knew by heart. May 7th, at the dock, at sunset, I'll be there. She had been there. I had been there. And yet, we had missed each other by minutes, minutes that now felt like miles, like an entire lifetime. I refused to believe that was the end. So I stood up, gathered what strength I had left, and began looking for answers. The first place I went was the port office, a brick building that smelled of damp paper and tobacco, where a clerk with tired eyes and yellowed shirt sleeves asked me to spell her name 3 times before sliding a logbook across the counter. His fingers flipped through passenger lists, pencil tapping lightly, lips muttering dates and cabin numbers, and then he found her. Emily Hawkins, he said, boarded this morning. Ship SS Golden Gate, destination Anchorage, Alaska. The words hit me like a punch. Anchorage, not Vancouver, not Seattle. She hadn't mentioned Alaska. My mouth went dry. I wanted to ask more, to demand more, but the clerk was already closing the ledger, already moving on to the next man behind me asking about freight. I left, dazed, the name Anchorage ringing in my ears like something surreal. I wandered the harbor, asking anyone who might have seen her, fishermen loading nets, teenagers selling newspapers, sailors rolling barrels of supplies. Most just shook their heads, too busy, too indifferent, too used to seeing stories like mine played out in silence. But then an older man, his cap low, his hands thick with calluses, told me he'd seen a woman crying that morning near the gangway of the Golden Gate. She looked like she was waiting, he said. Real, still. Then they called final boarding and she just walked up, said something like, "He's not coming, is he?" He didn't know who she was talking about. I did. I sat on the steps of a loading dock after that, head in my hands, watching the cranes swing overhead like slow pendulums marking the death of another chance. I pulled out an envelope I had brought, one I never mailed, and wrote to the address she had left in one of her letters from over a year ago, not even knowing if it still existed. I came. I was there. I saw the ship leave. Were you waving? Was that really you? I posted it at the corner station on Market Street, not expecting a reply, but needing to send it, because doing something, even if pointless, felt better than doing nothing. In the days that followed, I tried everything. I contacted the shipping company, asked for records, begged for a forwarding address, but privacy laws stood in the way. I wrote to the postmaster in Anchorage, to veterans' aid centers, to church offices that might have known her name. I visited her old neighborhood in the Mission District, asked the grocer she once mentioned in a letter, but he didn't remember her. Said the war changed everything. People moved, people vanished. I checked hospital registries, refugee lists, church ledgers. Nothing. It was as if she had stepped onto that ship and disappeared into a fog no map could penetrate. And yet, I kept returning to the dock. Every evening at sunset, I'd stand at the same place I saw her last, or thought I did, and I'd watch the ships come and go, hoping for some sign, some message in the wind. I imagined her in Alaska, maybe sitting by a fire, wondering if I ever made it. I imagined her walking down an unfamiliar street, holding on to the past like I was. I imagined her happy. I imagined her gone. It wasn't just hope that brought me back. It was duty, because promises don't vanish just because they weren't fulfilled the way you imagined. Sometimes, keeping a promise means showing up, even if the other person has already walked away. And so, I searched. Not for her, Not really, but for the thread between us, that invisible thread that had stretched across war, across oceans, across silence, and still hummed softly in the quiet spaces of my life. I needed to know that the story hadn't ended at the dock, that somewhere beyond the fog and the tide, something of us still remained. Years passed. Not all at once, not in some cinematic sweep of seasons, dissolving one into the next, but slowly, like rain soaking through an old coat, like memories dulling around the edges, like letters yellowing in drawers you forget how to open. And yet, through all that time, through jobs and rooms and borrowed mornings, I carried her with me in the spaces between, in the silence that always is followed when someone asked why I never married, or why I kept returning to the waterfront like a ghost retracing his final steps. Because even though I never found her again, not really, not fully, she never left me, not in the ways that mattered, not in the quiet architecture of who I became. I stayed in San Francisco. I couldn't bring myself to leave the city that had almost held our reunion, the city that carried both the weight of that missed moment and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, something of her still moved within it. I found work restoring books at a small library, tucked between a bakery and a pawn shop, a quiet place where the scent of dust and aging paper felt oddly sacred, where I could spend hours breathing in stories that weren't mine, while trying to hold together the fragments of the one that had defined me. Every morning I walked past the ferry building. Every evening I paused at the same bench overlooking Pier 5, my hands tucked deep into my coat, waiting for a silhouette I no longer expected to appear. I never stopped writing to her, not real letters, not ones I could send, but pages filled with the life I might have shared with her if the world had turned just a little more kindly. I wrote about the foghorns and how their echo felt like her name stretched across water. I wrote about the jazz club I visited once, where the singer's voice cracked mid-note and somehow reminded me of the way Emily used to laugh when I told stories that didn't quite land. I wrote about growing old, about watching friends get married, raise children, move away, start again. I wrote about staying. I wrote about remembering. Then, one afternoon, 10, maybe 12 years after the war, a letter arrived, postmarked from Toronto. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable even after all that time. It was hers. Inside was a single page, no greeting, no closing, only a few short lines written in ink that had bled slightly from age or tears. I'll never know. You arrived too late, but knowing you came back for me saved something in me. That has to be enough. That was all. There was no return address, no mention of a new life or a husband or children or Canada, no explanation of where she'd gone or why. Just the confirmation that she had seen me, maybe from the deck of the ship, maybe from the dock in those lost minutes, and that it had meant something, that I had not dreamed it all. I read that letter more times than I could count, folded and unfolded it until the creases wore thin, slept with it under my pillow, tucked it into my wallet like a photograph, and somehow, in those few words, she gave me more than any reunion ever could have. Because what I had chased across years and oceans wasn't really her body, her voice, her presence. It was the need to know that what we'd shared had survived, that it had mattered, that I had mattered. I never saw her again, never heard another word, but I stopped looking, not out of resignation, not because I gave up, but because I no longer had to. I knew, and in that knowing, something inside me settled. I remained alone, but not lonely. I had a quiet life, a good life. I helped young veterans navigate the messy return to civilian reality. I cooked simple meals. I collected first editions. I tended a small garden that bloomed wildly every spring, as if reminding me that things can grow again, even from soil scorched by grief. I walked. I waited. I remembered. Every year on May 7th, no matter the weather, I went to the dock. I'd sit there at sunset, same bench, same hour, same tide creeping in around the rocks. I'd watch the ships pull in, watch strangers embrace on the platforms, watch the way light slid across the bay like a promise unkept. I never expected to see her walk toward me again. But I always sat a little straighter, just in case. And in those moments, in that stillness, in that ritual, I wasn't mourning what we lost. I was honoring what remained. A promise, kept the only way we could. I write this now not in search of sympathy, nor out of some romantic desire to resurrect a past that has long since folded itself into the deeper layers of memory, but simply because I need to place this story somewhere outside of myself, to give it form, to let it breathe, to let it drift out into the world like a bottle set afloat on the tide, carrying within it a small, persistent truth, that even when love doesn't end the way you imagine, even when it's scattered by war, silence, and missed moments, it still leaves something behind that refuses to be washed away. People speak often of closure, as if it was something you could pack into a suitcase, zip shut and store away, but I've learned that some stories don't end with answers. They end with understanding, with stillness, with grace. The dock where I once promised to meet Emily no longer looks the same. The wood has been replaced, the signage changed, the skyline reshaped by time and commerce and forgetting, and yet for me, it remains untouched. In my mind, I still see it as it was that day, bathed in golden light, sea air thick with salt and longing, and the horizon stretching out like a held breath. I can still hear the hum of engines, the shouts of sailors, the slow churn of the water against pilings. I can still feel the weight of the letter in my pocket. I can still see her, or think I do, one hand lifted, scarf fluttering in the wind, as if she knew I'd be watching. I never held her again. I never kissed her beneath that sunset sky. I never danced with her in the kitchen or fell asleep with her head on my shoulder. But I loved her, fully, truthfully, endlessly. And I kept the promise I made, even if the world conspired to keep us from the same dock at the same moment. There's something sacred in that, something whole. Because love, at its core, is not about possession or guarantees or the ticking of clocks. It's about showing up, about believing, about returning, even when you're afraid there's nothing left to find. And in that sense, I did return. I was there. I came back for her, just as I said I would. And she saw me. She knew. I still visit the dock from time to time. Not because I'm waiting for her, not because I expect to see her step off a ship with the same eyes and the same laugh from half a century ago, but because part of me remains anchored there. Not in sorrow, but in reverence. Because that place, that moment, that promise, they shaped who I became. And though I've grown old, though my hands have learned to tremble and my legs to slow, though the world has shifted beneath my feet more times than I can count, one thing has never changed. I remember. I remember her voice in her letters. I remember her courage. I remember the way she believed in a version of us that could survive the darkest of days. And I honor that by carrying her name, not just in my memory, but in the way I live, quietly, sincerely, with devotion stitched into the smallest of gestures. Some love stories don't have reunions, but they don't disappear either. They live on in the places we return to, in the vows we whisper to the sea, in the letters we never send but never stop writing. They live on in the dock that lives inside us, the place where we once waited, where we once believed, where we still do. We post new true stories every day, stories of love, of loss, of people who never gave up. If this one stayed with you like it stayed with me, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. You never know who might be waiting to hear something just like this.